She didn't resist, didn't speak. An elderly black woman just sat silently in court. But the white cop twisted open a water bottle and poured it over her silver hair. "Outdated symbols need to be washed away," he muttered, smirking as he walked off, like she meant nothing. What he didn't know? She's the mother of a deep-cover DOJ agent. When you think someone will stay silent forever, you just signed your own sentence. Watch till the end to find out. Does real power come from a badge or from the blood that raised it? Alma Watkins sat still as stone on the courthouse steps, her hands gently folded over a weathered black and white photograph. The picture, creased at the corners, showed a younger man in a pastor's collar, his face solemn but defiant, his wrists bound by the steel cuffs of 1965. Behind him, a blurred line of marchers held signs that history would one day frame with reverence. The sunlight struck her silver hair, pulling soft glints through each strand, and her long purple skirt moved only slightly in the late Brenton wind. It was a quiet kind of heat that clung to the bricks, the kind that held its breath before a storm. The sound of boots broke the rhythm, sharp, heavy, unhurried. Then a shadow stretched across her lap, long and angular, cast by the man now standing before her, Rick Allen, sheriff, authority in mirrored sunglasses and stiff khaki. He didn't speak at first, just stood, eyes hidden behind the lens, jaw tight. And then he kicked the leg of her folding chair, not hard enough to knock her over, just enough to insult. The chair creaked beneath the sudden jolt, but Alma didn't flinch. Her fingers stayed over the photograph. "Waiting on a ticket back to the good old days, ma'am?" His voice cut like a razor stripped of purpose, thin, mean, gleaming with a cruelty that wasn't theatrical but casual, practiced. Allen smirked as he looked her over, not in her eyes, not with respect. He looked like someone who thought decay had no voice worth hearing. Alma lifted her gaze slowly, the way clouds shift just enough to let the sun glare through. Her eyes met his with something that wasn't challenge, wasn't fear, wasn't even disdain. It was older than all those things. Her voice came steady, like a bell rung from a deep place. "I'm waiting for a courtroom with justice inside it." That single sentence held the weight of years. It was not a question, it was not a plea. Allen's jaw twitched. The smirk returned, thinner this time, like he needed it to remind himself of control. He pulled a small black radio from his belt, thumbed the button with a flick that made his impatience visible. "We got a loiterer on the courthouse steps," he said flatly, turning slightly so his voice hit the receiver. "Older woman, obstructing public order, possible agitator." He looked at her as he spoke the words, like he wanted them to sting, like he needed to hear them aloud to turn a sitting woman into a threat. Alma blinked once, slowly, still didn't move her hands from the picture. Behind them, the courthouse loomed, white stone washed with decades of decisions, appeals, sentences, and silence. The breeze lifted the hem of her skirt and set it drifting against Allen's boot. He moved it back slightly, like her presence dirtied the leather. No one came rushing out to stop him. No camera crews, no reporters, just a street breathing in, holding tension like thunder holds electricity before the crack. Allen stepped closer. His boots are now fully in her space. His fingers flexed once at his side. "You know what happens to people who think the law is some poetic thing they can interpret?" His words came slower now, almost enjoying themselves. "They get run over by the ones who understand it's just a hammer. And I swing it." He waited, expected fear, maybe even a flinch. But Alma only looked past him, not around him, not through him, just beyond, like he wasn't important enough to block the view. He grunted and took another step. "You think just because your husband wore a collar and got arrested 50 years ago that anyone still cares? He's dust. That photo doesn't talk anymore. And neither do people like you. Not in my county." The wind shifted, cooler now. Brenton skies are turning slightly yellow, grapped in the west. The courthouse flag flapped once, making a sound like cloth cutting through the air. Still, Alma did not rise, did not speak. Her stillness was deliberate, an anchor, not apathy. Alan hated it. You could see it in the way his shoulders rolled, in the curl of his lip, in the quick tug of the radio back into its clip. He wasn't used to not being the loudest thing in the scene. Power, when it's used to obedience, gets itchy in silence. "You like sitting here, huh?" he said. "Pretending to be part of something sacred? Newsflash, lady, you're just making a mess." Then, lower, sharper, "And I clean messes." His words left no space for ambiguity. They weren't just about her presence. They were about erasure, about treating memory like litter, about declaring ownership over truth. From the far side of the plaza, a teenager paused with a skateboard under one arm, watching. Two men in suits passed by without glancing. A woman pushed a stroller, eyes forward, no one interfered. But something hung in the air now, an awareness, like watching the sky change colors in real time. Alan leaned down, not far, just enough to bring his voice into her breathing space. "Let me guess. You think sitting here is going to change something? That someone's going to see your little protest and suddenly the world tips back toward righteousness?" He chuckled once. It was joyless, performed. "What's next? You sing? You pray? You get locked up and hope for a headline?" Alma finally moved. One hand, just the fingers, shifted to the edge of the photograph. She pressed it down, anchoring it against a rogue gust. Then she looked at him again, and in that look was everything she didn't say. "I've been hit harder than your voice. I've been bent but not broken. And I've seen men like you come and go, always thinking they're the end of the story." Rick Allen, for a moment, saw that, and he hated what he saw. The sky dimmed just slightly more. A breeze kicked up from the northeast. The kind of wind that made people close windows without realizing why. The courthouse bell tower loomed silent, and still Alma sat. The photograph is safe in her palm. Her spine was straight. Her silence was louder than Alan's radio crackle. The world had not changed yet, but the air said it would. The wind shifted behind them, as if reluctant to stay. Alma didn't move, but the shadow that stretched across her knees pulled back as Alan stepped forward with purpose, the leather on his belt creaking like something impatient and cruel. He didn't ask, he didn't warn. He simply reached behind his back and drew a pair of steel handcuffs, the oversized kind meant for intimidation, not function. The cold metal clicked open with a sound like a blade locking into place, and without ceremony, he wrenched one wrist up from her lap and snapped the cuff around it. The second shackle followed with a jerk that dragged her photo to the ground. Alma looked down at it, but said nothing. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was the kind of composure that enrages men like Alan, because it reminds them they haven't broken anything yet. No ID, no permit, no reason to sit here soaking up sympathy like sunlight. He sneered, the cuffs rattling as he hoisted her upright with too much force for someone half her age. "That's called trespassing. That's called incitement." He didn't bother making it legal. Alan didn't need a warrant, not in his mind, not in Brenton. In his world, the badge was the paper, and his word was the ink. Alma stumbled once as the chair scraped backward. The photograph fluttering on the steps behind her like a feather left behind by a warbird. She didn't cry out. She didn't ask why. She stood straight once, balanced, and the way she squared her shoulders made the handcuffs look ornamental, not oppressive. Alan shoved her toward the cruiser with an edge that was all about proving control. Not just over her body, but over the narrative. He opened the door with a slap of his palm and practically stuffed her inside. The steel interior of the patrol car was hot, tight, designed to erase dignity. Alma adjusted the hem of her skirt before sitting, careful not to let the fabric catch or tear. She moved with the grace of someone who knew how to keep her dignity intact even when the world handed her chains. Alan climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door like punctuation. The car roared to life with a guttural hum, and the windows buzzed as they rolled up, sealing them in. The silence between them was short-lived. He tilted his head slightly, almost as if in conversation, but his voice wasn't interested in discourse. It was a needle dragging across vinyl, all scratch and disdain. "You know," he began, drawing out the syllables like poison melting sugar, "every time one of you old black ladies decides to sit somewhere you don't belong, it just pisses the young ones off more." He didn't look at her. He didn't have to. His voice was a weapon he'd learned to fire without aiming. Alma turned her head slowly, meeting the side of his face like someone addressing a dog they didn't fear. Her voice, low and unflinching, cut through the stagnant air. "They're angry," she said, "'cause men like you keep pretending you're the law instead of just wearing its costume." Alan's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. The tires groaned against the pavement as he took a corner too fast, as if velocity could drown out the sound of being accurately named. He didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to being spoken to that way, especially not by someone who wasn't supposed to still have teeth left in her mouth. They drove in silence, though the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of Alan stewing in the humiliation of being called out without fanfare. His power relied on fear, and Alma had none to give. Outside the window, Brenton rolled by, its buildings familiar and sunburned, watching like witnesses too old to intervene. As they pulled into the gravel lot behind the station, dust kicked up around the tires like ghosts rising for judgment. Alan yanked the gearshift into park and exited the car without a word. Then he opened her door, not with respect, but with the briskness of a man taking out the trash. He grabbed her arm, not bruising, but rude, and pulled. Alma's foot caught on the lip of the doorframe, and for a split second she teetered forward. She caught herself, of course, but it was the kind of stumble Alan lived for, the kind that permitted him to smirk as he hissed, "What's the matter? No cross to lean on this time?" The insult was aimed like a spitball at her faith, at her age, at the photograph, still left behind on the courthouse step. It was meant to pierce not just skin, but history. Alma stood tall again, regaining her balance without a word, but with an expression so level, so composed it made Alan's smirk falter for half a second. That fleeting moment of unease in his eyes, that flash of recognition that maybe he hadn't pushed her down so much as walked into her shadow, vanished as quickly as it came. But it had been there. Alma saw it. He marched her through the back entrance of the station, past an officer who looked up, recognized the scene, and then looked down again. No one asked what the charges were. No one offered a chair. No one questioned why a woman who couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds needed those massive handcuffs, or that level of force. That was the air Alan cultivated. Deference, not justice. Routine, not accountability. The door to the holding area buzzed as Alan keyed in a code. He didn't even glance at her as he muttered, "Don't worry, we'll make sure you're comfortable. Maybe bring in a choir, recreate the old days for you." The sarcasm slithered out of him, thick and venomous. Alma finally spoke again, and when she did, her voice was quieter than before, but more dangerous. "This isn't about me being comfortable. This is about you needing to feel taller." Alan didn't reply. He didn't have a comeback for that. So he turned the insult into a shove instead, pushing open the cell door with one hand and gesturing with the other like she was livestock. Alma stepped in under her power. Behind her, the door clanged shut. The sound echoed down the corridor, heavy and metallic, the kind of noise meant to confirm a victory. But Alan didn't feel like a victor. Not really. Not when her last sentence kept running loops in his ears. Not when she stood there, hands still cuffed but posture unbowed, looking not like a detainee, but like a sentinel. He turned to walk away, but his footsteps were slower now, less sure, and the silence that followed him down the hallway, hers, the other officers, even the buildings itself, wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of judgment, and it hung in the air like smoke after a fire that hadn't finished burning. The echo of Alan's footsteps down the corridor was a slow death knell, each step measured, deliberate, a man savoring the illusion of control. Behind the cold gray door, Alma waited in silence, not because she had no words, but because she knew when silence was sharper than any reply. When the door opened again, it wasn't with ceremony but with force, an impatient push that let the fluorescent light spill in ahead of him like an accusation. He entered the room like a bad decision made permanent. The overhead light flickered once, then blasted full power, flooding every corner of the room in a sterile white that erased shadow and comfort alike. There was no clock, no window, just four walls and one eye of light above, watching. Alan didn't speak at first. He circled. His boots clicked against the floor, not loud, but steady, like a predator making sure its prey could hear. In one hand, he held his baton, short, black, cold. He tapped it slowly into his palm, each slap a punctuation mark in a sentence not yet spoken. Around and around he walked, orbiting her like a live orbiting a buried truth, closing in, testing for weakness. Then he stopped, just behind her shoulder, and leaned in slightly, his breath sharp as winter. "You think wrinkles buy you respect?" he said, low and cutting, "that age earns silence instead of suspicion?" The baton rapped once against his palm, not loud but precise. "Because I'm here to tell you, old lady, I don't kneel for ghosts." Alma didn't answer. Her head remained level, her eyes forward. She'd been in tighter rooms than this. She'd stared down snarling dogs and riot shields. A ceiling light and a coward in uniform weren't going to crack her. Alan moved again, this time stepping around to face her, narrowing the space. His voice climbed, not volume but intensity, the hiss of a man who thinks cruelty is a birthright. "I've seen your type," he said, voice curling like smoke. "Always marching, always preaching, always screaming about rights and dignity while you line up for welfare checks and cry over history like it owes you something." He took a step closer, tapping the baton now against the edge of the table, the plastic thudding like a slow, steady drumbeat. "You know what this town thinks when it sees you sitting out there on those courthouse steps? Not justice, not pride, just a relic, just another black and white picture in a textbook no one opens anymore." Still, Alma didn't blink. Her expression remained unreadable, but the room had begun to change, not in temperature, not in sound, but in charge, like static before a strike, like a match held near oil. Alan leaned on the table with one arm, staring down at her like proximity could dominate. "Say something," he spat. "Isn't that what you people do best? Yell, moan, demand?" Alma finally moved. She looked up, not fast, not defiant, but deliberate, as if she'd just remembered he was still there. Her eyes met his with no flicker, no tremble, only weight. Then she said, quiet and unshaken, "And you wear the hat of the powerful to hide the cowardice behind your eyes." The room froze. Not literally, but the silence that followed made every molecule of air feel like it had stopped moving. Alan's face shifted, not broken, not humbled, but stunned. He hadn't expected that. Not from her. Not with the cuffs still on her wrists, not under that floodlight. For a second, just one, his baton stopped moving. Then it resumed, faster. He slammed it once against the table, a sharp crack that echoed off the cinder block walls. "You want to lecture me?" he barked. "You think you're still in a pulpit somewhere, giving Sunday sermons to the converted? This isn't 1965, lady. No marches here, no reporters, no sympathetic headlines. Just you, me, and the fact that I don't have to give a damn about your past." He stepped back and walked a tight arc behind her, baton thudding against his palm with renewed rhythm. 1, 2, pause, repeat. His steps matched the tempo, like he was composing a song of intimidation. The light buzzed above them. The walls said nothing. The air remained lead-heavy. "Your kind made this town soft," Alan sneered. "With all your talk of equality and forgiveness and unity." He stopped in front of her again. "You want to be respected? Earn it. Stand up, without using history as your crutch." Alma looked at him, and in her silence was a fortress. There was nothing weak in her stillness. It mocked him. Her composure wasn't passive. It was defiance distilled. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her calm was louder than his fury. Alan hated it. He hated how every word he threw slid off her like oil on stone. He hated how she didn't flinch, didn't fold, didn't crumble. He hated the memory of the photo on the courthouse step, and the quiet truth it carried. He hated that, somewhere, despite all this, a camera could be watching. That, he couldn't be sure. He slammed his baton again on the table, the loudest yet. "You got nothing to say now," he shouted. "No grand lines about freedom or rights or redemption." Alma raised her head once more. Her voice came not as resistance, but as revelation. "I've said what needed saying," she said. "You just can't hear over the sound of your fear." Alan froze. The baton hung in his hand, suddenly inert. His jaw clenched, and for the briefest moment, the mask slipped. Not the authority, not the uniform, but the hollowness underneath. A man used to control realized that control wasn't the same as power. A man raised by a system that told him might made right, now staring at someone who'd survived it and remained unbent. He stepped back, not far, just enough to signal something subtle. Retreat. The room didn't feel like his anymore, not fully. The light was still his, the baton, the badge, but Alma? She belonged to no one, and that made her dangerous in a way no law book could counter. Alan didn't speak again. He left the room as quickly as he'd entered, but not before the baton thudded one last time against the table, a final note, desperate to reclaim the dominance he knew he'd lost. Behind him, Alma sat still, not defeated, not tired, just present, her eyes focused. Her hands are resting, a queen uncrowned, but not unthroned. And in the echo of that final thud, there was no blood, but there was damage. Not to her, to him. The interrogation room still held the sting of that final thud. The baton's echo like a gavel with no justice behind it. Alan had left and returned with something new in his hand. Simple, plastic, harmless to the eye, a bottle of water. Clear, unbranded, the label half peeled from the heat. But in Alan's hand, even water wasn't water. It was stagecraft. He held it like a weapon, not a refreshment, and stepped back into the harsh white light like an actor refusing to leave a play he'd already lost control of. Alma remained seated, still, quiet, but in no way diminished. Her posture hadn't sagged, her breath hadn't changed. But the room had, like time itself had begun circling her, not him. Alan walked slowly, circling her again, not with the speed of authority this time, but the slow delight of a man who thought humiliation was the highest form of order. The bottle crinkled once as he twisted the cap. The sound broke the silence like a tooth-cracking bone. "You thirsty?" he said, stepping closer until his boots nudged the metal leg of her chair. His tone was almost soft, but it had the same sweetness as spoiled milk. "Or do you only drink from fire hydrants when there's a protest on Main?" He didn't wait for a response. Alan wasn't looking for conversation. He was looking for spectacles, and Alma, steady in her chair, gave him none. He tilted the bottle slowly, watching her face for a flicker of reaction. There was none. Then, with the kind of care that mimics mercy, he began to pour. The water fell in a thin stream, first catching the light, then catching the crown of her silver hair. It slid through her curls like oil, catching at the strands, flowing downward with precision. Each drop a violation, each rivulet an attempt to erase something that could never be washed away. The water soaked into her scalp, trailed behind her ears, and pooled in the dip of her collarbone. It didn't rush. It wasn't violent. It was worse, calculated. Alan watched it move, smiling like an artist proud of his brushstroke. "You want it to be a symbol," he whispered, lips near her ear. "Well, here. Let me give you the pedestal you need." He poured more. The water darkened the soft lavender of her sweater, turning it plum. It ran down her back, disappeared beneath the cuffs around her wrists, and splattered in soft plinks onto the concrete floor. The drops formed a constellation beneath her chair, each one a small, shimmering indictment. Alma didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She didn't so much as blink. Her eyes closed, yes, but it wasn't retreat. It was an ascension. The kind of quiet that made gods out of grief and monuments out of pain. The water kept falling, and the sound of it was hypnotic. It wasn't loud, but it was final. It soaked the last pretense Alan had of being anything other than a child with a badge and a vendetta. He laughed. It was a hollow, gloating bark of a sound, made by someone who believed himself victorious simply because no one had stopped him. "Look at you," he said, stepping back to admire the result, like a statue in a storm. "Except no one's building museums for you, lady." Still, she didn't speak. Not yet. The last drops dripped from the bottle's mouth, the plastic now limp in his hand. He tossed it to the side. It landed with a hollow rattle that sounded embarrassingly small. Alan looked at her, expecting something, shame, fury, despair, anything. Then she opened her eyes. They weren't angry, they weren't pleading, they were calm. Impossibly so, calm like the ocean before it crushes a fleet, calm like a truth that no longer needs to shout because its existence is undeniable. Her gaze hit Alan like a slap, not physical, not loud, but sharp, bone deep, and worst of all, true. That look didn't fight him, it measured him. It didn't rage, it mourned the weakness he thought was strength. In those eyes, Alan wasn't a sheriff, wasn't a man. He was a moment, a mistake, a name already falling out of relevance. Something in his throat twitched, just for a second. A flicker of discomfort, of recognition, but pride, rotten, stubborn pride, would not let him break. He turned his back, wiped his hand on his pants as though to rid himself of her silence, of the way her dignity had soaked through even the water. The room, once so cold and clinical, now felt humid, claustrophobic, as if the walls themselves understood they'd just witnessed something irreversible. Alma didn't move. She sat in the wet, her sweater clinging to her skin, her hair hanging in silver cords, water trailing down her spine like a second backbone. But nothing about her posture had changed. If anything, she looked taller. Alan reached for the door. The handle slipped slightly under his grip, his palm damp from the bottle or the moment. It was hard to tell. He yanked it open and stormed out without a word, as if speech had abandoned him. And in that room, under the buzz of that pitiless light, sat a woman, soaked in water, but not defeat. She looked ahead. She did not wipe her face. She did not shake off the drops. She let them fall. The room dripped, but it was not she who broke. The water still glistened on Alma's skin, tracing the line of her cheekbone like a crown forged in silence. But in another room, darker, quieter, colder, the light told a different story. A surveillance monitor hummed in grayscale tones, its flickering screen slicing the darkness like a scalpel. The feed played in real time. No sound, just images. A woman soaked in dignity, and a man in uniform fleeing the aftermath of his cowardice. In front of the monitor sat a man whose spine didn't touch the backrest. He didn't slouch. He didn't blink much either. His posture was a blade, forged from discipline and years of being underestimated. The soft glow of the screen lit only half his face, casting the other in unreadable shadow. He was still, perfectly still, except for his eyes. Those eyes didn't flinch when the bottle tilted. They didn't wince when the water met the silver threads of Alma's hair. They didn't shift when the plastic hit the floor or when Alan disappeared through the door like a villain too weak to face the consequences of his theater. The eyes only narrowed fractionally, but with purpose. And then, with the quiet precision of a trigger pulled by certainty, Samuel Watkins moved his right hand to the console and pressed a button labeled simply. The screen blinked once. A red dot pulsed in the corner. Then came the voice, low and composed, as clinical as it was final. Target confirmed. Begin acquisition of original footage. His tone had no tremble, no emphasis. It was not the voice of vengeance. It was the voice of a man who'd been waiting for this exact moment. Not in rage, but in clarity. Not in noise, but in resolve. Samuel stood. The movement was fluid, practiced, unhurried. No one moved like that by accident. His hands didn't hesitate as they adjusted the cuffs of his jacket. One by one, screens went black around him, systematically powered down as if he were folding up a chapter with surgical finality. The badge clipped to his chest read, Larry Peters, Technical Consultant. It dangled slightly as he moved, but held no weight. Without a glance, he reached the console, unclipped the tag, and laid it gently on the table. It didn't clatter. It didn't fall. It was placed like a body. Then he turned, leaving the surveillance room in silence, the door closing behind him with a whisper instead of a slam, a final exhale of a lie he no longer needed to wear. The hallway outside was dimly lit, empty, but every step he took seemed to mark the floor with unseen consequences. His presence wasn't loud, but it reverberated. He didn't walk like he belonged. He walked like he owned time, like every second was a countdown only he could hear. In the monitor room, the screen still showed the image of Alma, unmoving but undefeated, water trailing down her spine like memory refusing to dry. That feed now lived in a secure backup, and only one person had access to it, and that person had just unmasked himself without saying a word. Samuel didn't look back, because justice wasn't something he chased anymore. It was something he orchestrated. Precisely. And right on time. Samuel Watkins moved through the hallways of Brenton County Courthouse like a shadow that knew exactly where it belonged. Not rushed, not hesitant, simply invisible by design. Every hallway turn, every glance at the mounted cameras, every footfall across the government-grade tile floor. It all moved to a rhythm he'd composed long before the first insult hit his mother's skin. This wasn't vengeance. It wasn't anger. It was an execution. Silent, surgical, overdue. The key card slid through the terminal with a smooth, silent swipe. A green light blinked once, then twice, and the metal door to the secondary IT suite clicked open. The room was barely used, relegated to off-money diagnostics and firmware patching. Perfect for a man whose real credentials were buried beneath 6 layers of national clearance. Inside, the lights were dimmed low, only the glow of 3 flat monitors illuminating the walls. No posters, no photos, no clutter, just systems waiting to be told what mattered. Samuel sat down with the same posture he'd held as a child during sermons, straight-backed, unmoving, patient with purpose. He pulled a matte black laptop from a secure case and opened it without theatrics. The system booted in silence, blinking into life like a beast awakened not by hunger, but by duty. There was no standard operating system, no icons, just code. Pure, efficient, merciless. His fingers tapped the keys with rhythm. 8-character command strings, rotating encryption keys, layer after layer, peeled back like locks on a vault only he could open. This was muscle memory, not born of repetition, but born of preparation. Every keystroke had been rehearsed in his mind, over and over for years. Long before Alan's voice ever hit a recording, long before the water hit Alma's hair. This wasn't the beginning of something. It was the middle of something that had started the day Samuel learned how to stay silent in a world built to ignore the truth. One final command line blinked at him. Initiate. Brenton Alpha? He paused, only to speak the words aloud, softly, as if marking a grave with precision. Activate protocol Brenton Alpha. He hit return. The system didn't beep. It didn't blink. It didn't scream. It obeyed. In the surveillance matrix, hidden cameras embedded across the building, within smoke alarms, electrical panels, security badges, and even a cracked ceiling tile, shifted their internal routing. What had previously been dumped into temporary on-site storage was now diverted in real time to a secured Department of Justice cloud environment, double encrypted, then fragmented across 2 mirror servers in D.C., and all without alerting a single network admin. No logs, no flags, no trace. Only 2 people on Earth knew this protocol existed. One was retired. The other was Samuel. On a screen to his left, a live feed from Interrogation Room B sharpened into crystal clarity. Alma sat perfectly still, water still glistening across her shoulders. The cotton of her lavender sweater clung to her back, the fabric darkened by the cold mockery Alan had poured down her scalp. But her spine was straight, her hands, still bound, rested on the table with the calm of a monarch awaiting nothing. There was no audio feed. It wasn't needed. Her dignity screamed without sound. Samuel leaned forward, just slightly. "That was the last time you'll do that without a witness," he said. Not to the screen, but to the idea of Allen. To every Allen. To every man who'd ever believed silence was a shield. A new window opened. A countdown timer. Red digital digits pulsing. 0, 40, and 0 seconds. Exactly 40 minutes until the pre-cleared federal response team, operating under Emergency Clause 76A, would arrive under sealed jurisdictional authority. 40 minutes between justice watched and justice enforced. 40 minutes for the truth to breathe before the system remembered how to speak. He opened a second console, this one feeding from a motion detection array synced to Allen's access pattern. Every hallway step, every locked door keyed open by his badge was now mapped in real time across the building's schematic. It wasn't surveillance anymore, it was the strategy. Allen appeared on one of the side feeds, pacing in the hall, his uniform slightly disheveled, his smirk flickering as the adrenaline wore thin. He had no idea that he had already crossed the line, that the line had moved beneath his feet while he was busy pretending to be the law. Samuel didn't look away. He opened one last encrypted file, a contingency record with an identical copy of the video clip. The bottle, the water, the fall. He checked the hash code, verified the checksum, time accuracy down to the millisecond, no edits, no filters, just raw, horrifying truth. He tagged the file, evidence_1_Alma_per. Then, almost as an afterthought, he reached into the inner lining of his sleeve and adjusted the fabric. A small corner of deep blue and gold emerged, a sliver of an official DOJ badge, the real one, issued not for his cover identity, but for his true designation. Just enough to catch the light, just enough to remember who he was. Samuel Watkins, Federal Investigations Liaison, Covert Division, Case Origin, Personal. The case had never been about infiltration. It had never been about surveillance. It had always been about time, the right moment, the undeniable proof. The trap was not set, but waited for. He spoke into the encrypted comms link, low and even. Confirm cloud sync, begin triple backup, asset tag, Watkins. Designate Brenton Alpha under Tier 1 protocol. The response was instant. A green checkmark pulsed. Operation secured. Then, like a man who had simply finished a shift, Samuel stood. The laptop shut with a quiet click. He secured it into its foam-padded case and locked it with biometric verification. The case beeped once and went dark. He adjusted his collar, straightened his cuffs, and stepped back out into the hallway, once again wrapped in the unremarkable skin of Larry Peters, technical consultant. To the casual observer, he was a systems guy, on his way to troubleshoot a firewall, nothing more. But underneath the fluorescent lights and behind the buzz of quiet bureaucratic mundanity, something seismic had been set in motion. A legal quake, a federal pulse, a reckoning calibrated to detonate not with noise, but with record. As Samuel walked back toward the control station, his every step hummed with controlled momentum. Not vengeance, not wrath, something purer, something heavier, something earned. The courthouse continued to operate, oblivious to the storm swelling in its walls. But the storm had heard the call, and Samuel, calm, exact, and relentless, had just flipped the switch. The storm didn't roar. It arrived with the hush of inevitability. Outside the Brenton County Courthouse, the early afternoon sun glinted off the matte black paint of 6 unmarked SUVs that pulled into the government lot in a single, silent formation. No sirens, no lights, no horns, just the rhythm of movement born from precision, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Federal plate, bulletproof glass, tires built for speed and silence. When the vehicles stopped, their doors opened in unison, and out stepped 12 federal agents in tactical Navy not showy SWAT gear. Not the militant spectacle of a siege, but the armor of real authority. Controlled, trained, unstoppable. They moved in pairs, falling into a diamond formation with no radio chatter, no visible cues. Each motion was synchronized, a choreography of power meant not to intimidate, but to enforce. They were the kind of presence that changed the weight of air in a room. before the first word was even spoken. Each agent wore a reinforced vest with no insignia except a discreet badge patch. DOJ Special Intervention Unit. Their boots didn't stop, they settled, and when they crossed the threshold of the Brenton lobby, no one dared ask why. At that exact moment, inside Interrogation Room B, Rick Allen leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, lips curled in that same smirk he'd worn for most of his adult life, the smirk of a man who'd mistaken his uniform for immunity. He looked down at Alma, who still sat with wet shoulders and unbroken posture, her gaze fixed on nothing and everything at once. He tilted his head slightly, arrogance dripping from every syllable. "So," he said, his voice syrupy with mock patience, "you got anything left to say, or are we finally done playing martyr for the day?" Before Alma could speak, the steel door on the far end of the hall cracked open. Not kicked, not slammed, just opened, firmly, with the full force of the system behind it. The silence was shattered. Allen turned just in time to see the first federal agent step into the corridor, arm raised, credentials already in hand, a paper, stamped, sealed, signed. It wasn't a request, it was a notification. Emergency warrant, Section 4B, subsection Alpha, effective immediately. This facility is under federal observation and intervention, the agent stated with a voice like granite. He didn't shout, he didn't blink, he simply delivered. Allen stepped forward, shoulders puffed, face contorting into indignation. "What the hell is this? Who authorized this circus?" "I didn't get a call. I didn't sign." "You don't sign," came the voice behind the first agent. Another stepped forward, gloved hand landing firmly on Allen's shoulder, not aggressively, but with the finality of a judge's gavel. "You don't authorize anything anymore, Sheriff." The word sheriff hung in the air like a relic, already starting to sound wrong in real time. Allen's mouth opened, but nothing useful came out. He tried to square his stance, but the agents didn't flinch. They had passed through him like the future overtakes the obsolete, without needing permission, without offering grace. Behind them, more agents fanned through the building like a tide, filling every corridor, offices, evidence rooms, security hubs. Each space was cleared with clinical calm, no shouting, no weapons drawn, just presence. Each step forward was like a ledger being balanced. Every door opened was another column marked Justice Due. Allen looked past them, trying to find a face he could read, a uniform he could recognize, someone who would let him flip this back in his favor with charm, with authority, with fear. But all he saw were strangers, trained, armed, unmoved. The agent nearest to the interrogation room gestured toward Alma without speaking. One of his colleagues moved in, gently but swiftly unlocking the cuffs from her wrists. The sound of the metal unlatching echoed more sharply than anything Allen had heard all day. Still, Alma didn't rise, not yet. She simply turned her head toward Allen, and in her eyes was not satisfaction, not vindication, just confirmation, like the fulfillment of a prophecy never spoken aloud. She had not called them, she had not begged for rescue, she had endured. And endurance, it turned out, had teeth sharper than any badge. Allen tried again. "I demand to know." "You're not in a position to demand," the lead agent cut in, turning to him fully now. "You're in a position to comply." And with that, Allen was turned. Not dragged, not tackled, just guided. Arm behind his back, posture straightened, not by force, but by the sudden collapse of the illusion he'd wrapped himself in for years. The illusion that power given was the same as power earned, that fear was the same as respect. As he was walking past Alma, he looked at her, desperation cracking through his features for the first time. But she didn't meet his gaze. Not out of cruelty, out of completion. There was nothing left to see in him. He was already on the other side of history, and history finally had witnesses. The corridor still vibrated from the sentence Samuel had left in the air, as if the truth itself had become a force of nature, undeniable, weighted, seismic. Rick Allen, once the center of every room he entered, now stood cuffed, not just in metal but in reality, stripped of the only power he'd ever trusted. Illusion. The illusion of authority, of immunity, of untouchability, and in its place now stood the one thing he'd never prepared for, reckoning. Samuel didn't move for a long moment after the words left his mouth. "I'm the son of the woman you tried to humiliate." They didn't need to be repeated. They didn't echo, they didn't float. They landed, a blow that didn't bruise the skin but cracked the legacy. Alan stood facing him, eyes wild now, breath caught somewhere between a growl and a gasp. His instinct was to lunge, to bark, to dominate, but the cuffs held him. The hallway held him. And most of all, the eyes of Alma, watching from inside interrogation room B, held him. She didn't smile, didn't blink, didn't move. She did not need to. Samuel finally stepped closer, not quickly, not forcefully, but with the steadiness of someone who wasn't arriving, but returning to a place that was always meant to be his. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulled out the badge again, not to flash it like Alan used to, but to hold it level, dead center between them so there was no room for misunderstanding. "Samuel Watkins," he said, voice razor-sharp in its calm. "Special Investigator, Department of Justice. Effective immediately, you are being held under federal authority for abuse of power and racially motivated misconduct while acting in your capacity as a sworn officer of the law." Alan's lips curled, not in mockery this time, but in instinctual resistance. His voice scratched its way out of his throat, guttural, defensive. "Who gave you the right?" Samuel didn't flinch. "The Constitution," he said flatly, "and the blood my mother didn't let stain this floor." Alan took a half step back, not physical, but internal. His weight shifted, his balance betrayed him for a second, like the floor had tilted just enough to reveal the truth he'd been standing on was never stable to begin with. His eyes darted left, searching the hallway for backup, for familiar faces, for some shred of the command he used to wear like skin. But all he saw were federal agents, watching, recording, unmoved. "I want my lawyer," he said, snapping the words like a branch. "You'll have one," Samuel replied, almost with formality, "in due process, but right now, you're going to be processed." Alan gritted his teeth. "You think this means something? You think this little show changes anything?" "No," Samuel said. "You already changed it. I'm just the one writing it down." Two agents flanked Alan again. One scanned his badge, now revoked in the DOJ database. The other took inventory of his weapon, removed it from the holster and sealed it into an evidence bag. Every movement was routine, but within that routine lived the erosion of a man's legacy. The badge that once opened doors now meant nothing more than a placeholder on a growing list of wrongs. Alan twisted toward Alma as he was guided down the hall. "You did this," he spat. "Because of a picture? Because of a performance?" Alma finally stood. She did it slowly, with dignity so intact it made the cuffs on Alan's wrists seem decorative. She walked to the glass window and met his eyes, not like an enemy, but like a mirror. "No," she said, "because I raised a man who sees truth in silence, and you made the mistake of thinking that silence was surrender." Alan recoiled. His face shifted, cracked open by a truth too sharp to be denied. He turned to Samuel one last time. "You think you're some kind of hero now? Just because you pulled the trigger without a gun?" Samuel didn't blink. His voice remained surgical. "No. Heroes save lives. I'm here to remember the ones you thought didn't matter." The hallway door buzzed open, and Alan was led through it. For the first time in years, the man who called himself sheriff passed through a threshold where no one saluted, no one nodded, no one even looked at him like he belonged there. The silence was louder than sirens. Samuel stayed still. Agents moved around him, data uploaded, files tagged, evidence logged, but he didn't move, not yet. Because this wasn't a victory. This was gravity finally finding what had floated too long. Only after Alan disappeared behind the reinforced door at the end of the hall did Samuel finally turn back toward Alma. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He stepped into the interrogation room. No glass separated them now. No authority divided them. Just the air between two generations built from the same steel. For the first time that day, Samuel's voice softened. Not because it had to, but because he could. "Are you hurt?" Elma looked at him, her face wet with dried humiliation turned to strength. She nodded once. "No, just soaked." Samuel almost smiled. Almost, but there was no room yet. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a hand towel, not government-issued, not tactical, just something folded with care, meant for this exact moment. She took it, wiped the back of her neck, handed it back. "You saw everything?" Samuel nodded. "Everything. Did you record it?" He raised his eyes. "I achieved it." For the first time, Alma sat again, not out of fatigue, but choice. "Then it's no longer ours," she said. "It belongs to whoever needs to see it next." Samuel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The door shut behind Samuel like a curtain falling on the last act of a play whose ending had long been inevitable. Down the corridor, Alan was being led through a gauntlet of silence. No agent shouted, no one announced his name, no one raised a camera or a voice. Just the cold precision of a process he no longer controlled. He walked with the rigid posture of a man still pretending the chains on his wrists were a misunderstanding, a momentary glitch in the hierarchy he'd once ruled without question. But the stiffness in his back betrayed a growing fracture. He knew something had shifted. He just hadn't accepted it yet. As they entered the intake room, the mood thickened. Alan looked around and saw faces, some familiar, some not, but all of them carried the same quiet verdict in their eyes, that of the disowned. These weren't just strangers executing an order. These were lawmen, clerks, and deputies who had worked under him, adjacent to him, beneath him, and not one of them stepped forward. He snarled, half growling, half gasping. "What is this? You all just gonna stand there while they drag me through my damn station?" No one answered. One officer glanced away. Another adjusted his clipboard. The room, already cool, dropped 10 degrees with the weight of indifference. Alan twisted his head, eyes scanning for a single expression of alliance. He found none. "You think this is justice?" he barked. "This ain't justice. This is betrayal." The venom in his voice cracked with something close to desperation. "All because of her? Because she sat on a damn step?" And then she appeared. Alma stood at the far end of the hallway. No guards, no fanfare, just her presence. Dignified, calm, unshaken. The lavender sweater still clung to her, now dry but stained in streaks that memory wouldn't forget. Her silver hair was combed back, every strand like a flag in still air. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't raise her chin. She simply watched him, like a page closing in a book that didn't deserve a sequel. Alan saw her and lost the last of his grip. "You set me up!" he screamed, lunging forward against the agents holding him. "You think this makes you some kind of saint? You used your kid, your little tech rat of a son, to bait me? To ruin me?" The agents didn't flinch. Neither did Alma. She walked forward, slowly, each step deliberate but not theatrical. She stopped only when she was close enough to look Alan in the eye. Her words came softly, measured, carved from stone. "I didn't do it for a son," she said. "I did it for a generation." That sentence didn't strike Alan like a slap. It hit like a mirror, showing him not what he was, but what he'd never be again. His mouth opened, but nothing coherent followed. His voice splintered. He tried to twist again, not in escape, but in denial, like movement could undo what silence had decided. A young deputy, barely 30, barely hiding the tension in his jaw, stepped forward without being asked. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't bark a command. He just reached for the badge on Alan's chest. The gesture wasn't forceful. It was surgical. Fingers closed around the metal, a slow pull. The fabric gave way without resistance, like it had been waiting to be freed. The badge came off with a whisper. The deputy didn't hand it over. He didn't salute. He looked Alan in the eye and said with quiet finality, "No one calls you sheriff anymore." Alan's chest rose sharply, like a man who'd just been punched in the lungs. His lips trembled. His eyes, red around the rims, scanned the room again, pleading now, not with arrogance, but with disbelief. Not a single person met his gaze. He gasped, "This is wrong. You all know me. You know who I am," but knowing was no longer a shield. knowing was an indictment. The agents resumed their grip. Alan didn't fight this time. His steps were slower now, heavy, not with weight, but with realization. As he passed Alma, he couldn't meet her eyes again. She didn't turn her head to follow him. The doors at the end of the corridor opened, not with drama, but with the quiet precision of closing history behind someone it would no longer carry forward. Alan disappeared beyond them, and no one looked back. The door hadn't even fully closed behind Alan before the world outside began to tremble. Not physically, not with sirens or boots, but in pixels and pulses. In shares and reposts, in whispers that crossed time zones before breakfast. Justice used to be a story carved in stone, slow, heavy, carried by men in suits through marble halls. But not this time, not in this age, because this time, justice came with a timestamp. It started as nothing more than a clip, 47 seconds. No headline, no dramatic music, just raw footage. A static frame from an overhead surveillance cam, grainy but focused, caught Alan's hand unscrewing the cap of a plastic water bottle. Then, with a tilt of the wrist that was almost casual, the liquid poured out. Not spilled, poured. It streamed down the crown of Alma's bowed silver head like holy water corrupted, trailing past her cheeks, soaking into her purple sweater. The voice above her was distinct, cruel, void of fear. Want a drink? Or do you prefer the fire hydrant from the marches? The camera didn't shake. It didn't zoom. It just held the image while the humiliation flowed. And then came Alma's eyes. They opened, not with vengeance, not with fire, but with clarity so sharp it could slice marble. That look alone was a verdict. Not a scream, not a plea, just a gaze that had endured decades and now stared back, unshaken. The video cut to black. No hashtags, no commentary, just silence. By 2:37 IEM, it had been retweeted 300 times. By 3 o'clock, it crossed the 10,000 mark. The algorithm didn't even know what it had caught. But the people did. Justice for Alma exploded by sunrise. It wasn't fueled by outrage alone. It was reverence wrapped in disbelief. The internet, so often a theater of irony, found itself in rare stillness. No one joked. No one meaned. The collective tone online was heavy, solemn, because the image struck somewhere old and deep. Cable news broke regular segments by 6 o'clock AIM. National anchors read the clip's transcript with tones normally reserved for presidential addresses. Social media platforms restructured trending pages just to accommodate the firestorm. The Department of Justice issued a preliminary statement before noon, something that had never been done over leaked footage before. In every corner of the country, people stared at their phones with their breath held. In coffee shops, in subway platforms, in living rooms and kitchens, the question rippled across every age, race, and income bracket. Did you see the video? More powerful than anger was the sound of recognition. Viewers didn't just see Alma. They saw a mother, a teacher, a neighbor, a ghost of someone history had tried to silence. They saw dignity under assault, and they saw it endure. By mid-morning, every major news outlet had picked up the footage. Commentators sat stiff in their seats as the video played behind them on a slow loop. Civil rights leaders, both old and new, were brought in. One elderly minister from Selma shook his head and said, "We bled for the right to be heard." But she didn't have to say a word. In a university lecture hall in D.C., a professor stopped his lesson on political theory and played the clip. No one moved. One student began to cry quietly without knowing why. In Detroit, a mural artist started painting before the sun fully rose. On the side of a brick building, her outline took form. Alma's face tilted, eyes forward, hair wet, and a single caption beneath, "Not defeated." The impact wasn't just emotional, it was systemic. Officials scrambled to respond. The Brenton Sheriff's Office locked its social media accounts. Internal memos leaked almost immediately. with frantic directives to control narrative and assess external risk. But it was already too late. Narrative had left the barn and galloped straight into history. By early afternoon, the footage wasn't just viral, it had become a symbol. Media outlets framed it as a watershed moment. But the public knew better. It wasn't the beginning of something new, it was the unearthing of something old, rotting beneath polite press conferences and community relations task forces. Alma didn't just sit under that bottle, she sat at the cross-section of history and present-day cowardice. Every detail of the video was dissected with surgical precision. The lighting in the room, the way Alan stood just slightly off-center suggested entitlement without the need for posture, the way he held the bottle, not with malice, but with apathy, like watering a lawn. The real horror wasn't his rage. It was his indifference. News anchors brought in body language experts who confirmed what millions already sensed in their gut. Alma's stillness wasn't weakness. It was resistance in its purest form. Her refusal to flinch was a scream louder than any protest chant, and when she opened her eyes, she wasn't just looking at Alan, she was looking through him, into every system that ever thought it could win by breaking dignity. In Washington, the White House press secretary was caught off guard during a scheduled briefing. When asked about the incident, her voice tightened. "We've seen the footage, and it is disturbing. The president has been briefed, but no statement could catch up to the velocity of truth." College students organized vigils on campuses. In Brooklyn, a group marched silently, holding up printed stills of the moment the water touched Elma's shoulders. In Houston, pastors rewrote Sunday sermons midweek to address not just forgiveness but fury. In Brenton, strangers began laying flowers outside her modest home, lilacs mostly, purple, soft and deliberate, like her. Elma herself remained silent. She gave no interviews, she issued no public comment. And that, more than anything, ignited the country's admiration. In a world drowning in noise, she remained an island of clarity. The more she refused to speak, the more people leaned in to listen. Then came the interview with Samael. It aired unannounced. No trailer, no preview, just a fade-in to a simple chair, a dim room, and a man whose name had not yet entered the conversation, but whose presence landed like a hammer on glass. The journalist didn't need to prompt him much. "I was watching," Samuel said, his voice low, steady, almost too calm, not as a spy, not as a tech, as a son. The interviewer asked the obvious, "So, what do you want to happen next?" Samuel's answer was surgical. "I don't want him jailed. I want the country to admit that for too long, it's let badges become masks. I want them to look at my mother and see who paid the cost of their security." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. His tone didn't demand justice, it made it inevitable. He didn't accuse, he confirmed. And confirmation is always more lethal. The internet went into full ignition. The phrase, "badges become masks," hit trending boards globally. Quotes from Samuel's interview were pasted on murals, retweeted by celebrities, and turned into protest signs within hours. Even those who had no idea where Brenton County was knew now that it was a name they'd remember. By that evening, dozens of artists had submitted renderings of Alma's image to digital museums. One showed her seated, not in the chair, but on a throne of broken chains. Another depicted her in grayscale, with the dripping water forming words in cursive. "I am not your lesson, I am your mirror." Meanwhile, Alan's name began to vanish, not from records, but from sympathy. He had become a placeholder for something bigger than himself, the rot inside the badge, the virus under the uniform. And yet he was not feared, he was pitied by no one. On national television, a round table of former law enforcement officers watched the clip together. One of them, an aging ex-chief with silver hair and hands that shook, said quietly, "That woman's silence spoke louder than any training manual ever written." In the days that followed, the footage became more than viral. It became doctrine. Activists printed stills from the video and passed them out like sacred pamphlets. The Book of Alma, One university satire paper titled it, only half joking, because that single frame, hair-drenched, lips sealed, spine like granite, had become scripture in a culture gasping for something unshakable. The clip was translated into over 30 languages. In Tokyo, it aired unedited on a giant digital billboard downtown with only one caption, "We see you." In Johannesburg, artists reimagined the frame as a stained glass mosaic for a church window. In London, it was projected on the side of Parliament, but the most powerful image came not from a screen, but from a child. At a middle school in Minneapolis, during a class discussion about civil rights, a 12-year-old girl stood and said, "Alma didn't move because she didn't have to. She already knew who she was." Her teacher, trying to hold back tears, simply nodded. Meanwhile, Samuel had vanished again. No press tour, no social media, no follow-up interview. His absence only deepened the gravity of his words. In an era where everyone fights to extend their 15 minutes, he disappeared into silence, like someone who never wanted a spotlight, only a reckoning. Alan, by contrast, remained silent in a different way. Not out of strategy, but because the walls were closing in. Legally, procedurally, reputationally, he was radioactive. No one wanted to be photographed with him. No department wanted to claim him. Even statements issued in his defense were met with swift backlash. He had become a walking PR disaster, and in the world of politics and power, that was worse than guilt. At one point, an anonymous source from within the sheriff's office leaked internal emails where Allen had attempted to pre-write a public apology. The draft, riddled with legal hedging and hollow phrasing, opened with, "If I offended anyone." The backlash was immediate and merciless. If, Twitter asked, try when. Then came the final blow. One that didn't come from a headline or a hashtag, but from the quiet return of Alma herself. No announcement, no press coordination, just a photograph. She was seated once again on the same steps outside the Brenton courthouse, in the same lavender sweater, stained slightly now, but worn with pride. This time, she wasn't alone. A small group of children seated around her on the pavement listened intently as she read aloud from a worn book of poetry. A local photojournalist captured it mid-same. Alma with her head high, a boy leaning into her shoulder, the courthouse looming quietly behind them. The caption read, "We found our compass." That image was plastered across morning papers nationwide. "Grace in the ruins," one headline read. "The Republic listens," said another. Even those who tried to shift the conversation found themselves choked by the simplicity of it. There was no crime scene, no courtroom theatrics, no yelling, just a woman, still wet in the memory of a nation, teaching children how to stand tall by sitting still. Back in Washington, a closed-door meeting was held by senior officials across multiple departments. The notes from that meeting, leaked, inevitably contained a single underlined sentence. "This is no longer about a county sheriff. This is a cultural reckoning." By the end of the week, the clip had reached more than 200 million views across platforms. It had inspired essays in law reviews, sermons in churches, murals on playgrounds, and rage in the hearts of millions. But perhaps more importantly, it had unearthed a quiet collective guilt, one that didn't scream or threaten, but lingered like smoke after a fire long ignored. Allen became a name too heavy to say aloud in polite company. Schools pulled down old plaques bearing his badge. Podcasts dedicated full episodes to the anatomy of institutional cruelty, using him as Exhibit A. Even those once reluctant to speak were now echoing one another with clarity. This wasn't about one man, but about every man who ever thought the uniform was a crown instead of a duty. And yet, Alma said nothing, not in print, not on camera, not even in passing remarks overheard by local journalists. Her refusal became a second revolution, an act of restraint so powerful that it silenced critics without ever needing to raise a finger. The image of her, seated at her porch, teacup in hand, hair still damp from the infamous moment, began to circulate again. This time, not as a still from surveillance, but from a portrait taken with care and reverence. A young photographer from Atlanta had driven 16 hours just to ask if he could take her picture, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as herself. She'd said yes, but only on one condition: no retouching. So the photo went out as it was. Her age was visible in every line. The moisture still clung to the strands of white hair resting on her shoulders. Her lips pressed in a calm line, and her eyes, unfaltering eyes, looked directly into the camera, through it, beyond it. That image, captionless, hung in the Smithsonian's Civil Rights exhibit by month's end. Beneath it, on the wall in simple black font, a single line from Samuel's interview: "You're respecting the wrong people." And suddenly, the clip didn't need to be played anymore. It had done its work. The moment was now living history, encoded into the memory of a nation always in need of reminding. Allen, for all his cruelty, for all his empty posturing and crude attempts at control, had been forgotten faster than he could defend himself. But Alma? Alma remained. She was no longer just a woman on a courthouse step. She was an icon carved in digital stone, a testament to poise beneath persecution. And whether people viewed the video for the first time or the 50th, they all reached the same conclusion. Justice doesn't always come with handcuffs or headlines. Sometimes it comes with a slow pour of water and a woman who refuses to flinch. And when the nation exhaled, it wasn't in triumph, it was in recognition, because some truths don't need to be shouted, they only need to be seen. He stepped out into the morning like a man walking into fire. The sunlight didn't warm, it exposed. The moment Rick Allen emerged from the Brenton precinct, his figure sliced through the crowd like a ghost that forgot it was already dead. Cameras snapped in violent flashes. Reporters swarmed with microphones drawn like bayonets. Their questions shouted more like indictments. But the real assault came not from their words, but from the silence between them. How each lens seemed to look not at him, but through him. He adjusted his collar with trembling fingers, tried to steel himself, and failed. His boots hit the concrete like they were too heavy for a man whose name had become synonymous with disgrace. Just weeks ago, that sidewalk would have cleared for him. Heads turned in deference. Now, even the pavement seemed to resist holding his weight. A reporter, with a voice sharp enough to pierce glass, fired the first shot. "Sheriff Allen, do you have anything to say to Alma Watkins?" Allen paused, mouth half open, reaching for that rehearsed grin, that old smugness, that toxic blend of charm and arrogance he used to wear like armor. But the moment he curled his lips, the crowd recoiled, not in fear, not in awe, but in revulsion. There were no polite nods, no sympathetic murmurs. Only 100 camera lenses were documenting his collapse frame by frame. Then, from the edge of the crowd, someone live streaming shouted with raw, unfiltered clarity, "She's the whole damn country. You're the stain on it." It hit like thunder. The voice wasn't angry, it was certain, and that certainty echoed, more profound than any insult Allen had ever received. He flinched, a twitch in the jaw, a blink he couldn't disguise, and in that moment the myth of the sheriff died on the courthouse steps. The next blow wasn't shouted. It was projected. That night, across the city skyline, Allen's infamous moment, hand poised above Alma's silvered hair, the stream of water frozen mid-pour, was broadcast in 30-foot clarity on the facade of Brenton's tallest building. No audio, no commentary, just the truth looped in silence, like a monument to cowardice. Tourists stopped in the street. Children asked questions that their parents didn't know how to answer. Couples on evening strolls stood shoulder to shoulder, no longer talking, just watching. No one looked away. Allen did, from his apartment, Curtains drawn, hands gripping the back of a chair, he stared at his disgrace lighting up the city he once controlled. His phone vibrated endlessly but offered no comfort. Messages weren't coming in, they were piling up like digital spit on a fallen idol, and the few calls he dared answer offered the same cold refrain, "We're distancing ourselves." He hadn't lost power. He'd lost permission. The media no longer asked for quotes, they asked for damage reports. Cable anchors no longer prefaced his name with sheriff or officer. He was simply Rick Allen, the man who poured water over a legacy he never understood. Talk shows mocked him, not for cruelty, but for cowardice. Even comedians, who once feared the backlash of touching political nerves, now roasted him without hesitation. What's the difference between Rick Allen and a leaky faucet? One quipped. At least the faucet's trying to be useful, but the worst came from the people who said nothing at all. Everywhere he went, eyes followed him, not in awe, not in fear, but in assessment. Supermarket clerks gave exact change without a word. Neighbors who once nodded now crossed the street. In a coffee shop downtown, a man read the paper with Allen's face on the cover, then folded it neatly and walked out without ever looking at him. It wasn't rage, it was a vacancy, the kind that tells you you've already been erased. He tried to speak out once, tried to call into a radio show to give his side, but was cut off mid-sentence by a host who simply said, "We're not here to clean up your spill." There was no space left for his voice. Not on air, not online, not in whispers. Even when he stood in front of cameras and tried to hold a press conference in his defense, the microphones tilted subtly away from him, like even the equipment had decided he no longer mattered. He raised his voice. "I made a mistake." Nobody flinched. He tried again, louder. "I've served this county for 30 years. No applause, no nods. Just silence, thick and final. That silence was the new law. By the time the projection on the building faded, the image had already replicated itself across the country. Flash mobs in Los Angeles recreated the moment on sidewalks using chalk outlines. In Chicago, a high school mural painted the scene in mosaic tiles, with Allen's figure blurred into static pixels, like a memory being deleted. In New York, a digital art collective created an AI bot that replied to any mention of Allen on social media with quotes from Alma. Her few words stretched like scripture across timelines. "I wait for a courtroom with justice." The bot didn't argue, it didn't threaten, it just reminded. And reminders were all Allen had left. No endorsements, no friends in the office, no podium to control. Even his official biography page on the county website now redirects to a public statement. "The Brenton Sheriff's Department does not condone the behavior captured in the recent footage. Mr. Allen is no longer associated with our institution." He read it 3 times. Each time it cut deeper. He wasn't just canceled. He was removed surgically, thoroughly, with the precision of a society desperate to correct its neglect. The backlash wasn't just against him, it was against everything he represented, and he knew it, he felt it, in the tightness of his chest, the cold sweat of every step outside, the way his last name now traveled faster than his shadow. He tried one last thing. He walked, alone, to a public square where protesters had gathered, not to shout back, but to be seen, maybe to find pity, maybe to spark some remnant of empathy. But as he stepped forward, someone quietly moved a sign into place between him and the crowd. It read, "We saw what you did. That's enough." And just like that, he turned around, because there was nowhere left to hide. He stood behind the podium like a man trying to exhume a version of himself long since buried. The lights were too bright, the air too sterile, and the microphones, clustered like vultures, waited not for truth, but for confession. Allen adjusted his tie with the same practiced gesture he had used for decades, back when the uniform still meant respect and not revulsion. His eyes scanned the room, but no sympathy returned the glance. The cameras blinked at him like indifferent witnesses. "I know what you've all seen," he began, his voice gravelly, strained from rehearsals in front of his bathroom mirror. "It was a stressful day. Emotions were high. I lost control." His hands gripped the podium harder than necessary, white-knuckled, desperate to anchor himself in a moment slipping through his fingers. "I didn't mean harm. That wasn't who I am. No one reacted. Not a single cough, not a shuffle of papers. Silence had become the room's verdict before the trial even began. He pushed forward. I've never treated anyone unfairly based on race. I don't see people that way. I've always upheld the law. But then the screen behind him lit up like a punch. A video clip, unedited, unblinking, showed his face inches from Alma's. Voice curling with disdain. You still waiting on water from the fire hoses? Queen of the handouts? The quote hung in the air like smoke, toxic and undeniable. Allen blinked. His mouth hung open, as if he could inhale the footage and erase it. He fumbled forward, voice cracking. That's taken out of context. You don't see what led up to that. You don't see what she said first. But the room wasn't buying. They weren't even bartering. One by one, journalists closed their notebooks. Pens capped, cameras lowered. Chairs creaked gently as reporters rose. Not in outrage, but in confirmation. They had heard enough. No one interrupted. No one shouted. They simply walked out, as if the air had grown too stale to breathe. A lone reporter muttered into a hot mic before leaving, "He's not apologizing. He's performing." The words, casual as a shrug, landed like a hammer. Allen stood there, frozen. As the room emptied, the podium in front of him, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a stage that had outgrown its actor. For a moment, he stayed still, hands flat on the wood, eyes glazed, as if hoping the crowd might return if he just stood long enough. But it didn't, and they wouldn't. The nation had seen enough, and when a man has nothing left but words and no one willing to listen, every sentence becomes a whisper to himself. The silence in the hearing chamber was not of hesitation, but of precision, the kind of silence that arrived only when everyone already knew the verdict, when the formality of procedure merely served as the final nail, not the decision itself. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile white glow over the curved rows of state officials, each seated with tablets open, documents glowing like verdicts on glass. No voices rose. No debate echoed through the room. This wasn't a courtroom, it was an erasure machine. At the far end of the table, a woman in a gray suit tapped her stylus once, then twice, before lifting her eyes. "This emergency session is hereby called to order," she said. Her voice, calm but unyielding, sounded like it had been sanded down by bureaucracy and sharpened by repetition. Agenda Item 1, the formal administrative review of Officer Rick Allen, former sheriff of Brenton County. The word former landed like a switchblade on glass. No one flinched, not even Allen, who wasn't present, not because he had refused, but because no invitation had been sent. This wasn't his trial, it was his deletion. A second official spoke, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice brittle with history. "This body has reviewed footage, press documentation, public testimony, and internal conduct files dating back 24 months. The conclusion is unanimous." He looked down to confirm what everyone already knew, as if reading the verdict was less for them and more a formality for the invisible audience of history. Effective immediately, all public commendations, ceremonial plaques, and formal references to Rick Allen in official departmental literature will be revoked. The phrase "revoked" didn't echo, but it settled. Heavy, absolute. On a screen at the center of the room, a live feed flickered into motion. A hallway inside the Brenton County Sheriff's Office appeared, its beige walls lined with framed portraits and golden nameplates, symbols of supposed honor. A junior officer walked into frame. He paused, reached up, and without ceremony unscrewed the brass plate reading "Sheriff Rick Allen" from the wood-paneled wall. Once, then the next. The plate dropped into his gloved hand with a clink that seemed to ripple through the chamber like a Then came the removal of the wall portrait. A photo of Allen in uniform, hand on heart, eyes narrowed in an expression meant to convey duty. The image now looked absurdly theatrical, a parody of valor. The officer stepped onto a small ladder, removed the frame from its hook and placed it face down into a cardboard box already half full. No pause for sentiment, no final salute, just a process. Clean, mechanical, and void of mourning. Meanwhile, in the command center of the department's central records system, A clerk opened the personnel file of Rick Allen. The interface was plain, an institutional gray trimmed in blue. At the top, a title bar read Sheriff Active. The clerk moved the mouse with practiced ease, highlighted the title, and began to type. The new designation blinked into place. Former officer misconduct discharged. A second later, a small icon lit up in green. Changes saved. There was no grand deletion, no flames, just a single click that carried the weight of a collapsing reputation. Back in the chamber, the lead chairwoman nodded. Please ensure these changes propagate across all official databases, both state and federal. Cross-referencing should reflect demotion status and severance with prejudice. Any commendation issued in the last 10 years is to be voided retroactively. She paused to sip water, as if casually rinsing the taste of Allen from her tongue. He is no longer to be referred to by rank, only by legal name, and even that, she added with a cold smirk, feels too generous. Someone in the back of the room coughed, not from sickness, but discomfort. Because what was happening wasn't just professional, it was existential. Rick Allen, once the name on patrol rosters, at community parades, on donation plaques and sheriff's department letterheads, was being extracted, piece by piece, not only from documents, but from identity. The state wasn't firing him, they were unwriting him. The woman with the stylus turned back to the feed on the screen. The camera now showed the entrance to the sheriff's office. The gold-lettered glass that once read Sheriff Allen was being scraped clean by hand. The letters, once etched with pride, now curled into strips of dead vinyl and dropped to the floor like shed skin. There was no applause, just the rhythmic hiss of the scraper, peeling back layers of authority 1 inch at a time. Back in the system database, Allen's internal profile flashed red, flagged for integrity review. A new line was appended. No longer eligible for rehire, reassignment, or representation. Birth date, still there. Address, still listed. But under position, there was only white space. That blank space didn't scream. It whispered something worse. You were here, and now you're not. The chairwoman spoke one last time. Let the record show that this administrative session has executed its mandate under full procedural authority. No appeals permitted. She didn't even wait for consensus. The room had moved past permission. They were now in the business of extraction. A final line was added to the minutes, subject identity reduced to non-operational reference only. Then the session adjourned. Outside, no protesters gathered. No allies raised banners. The public had already moved on, their verdict rendered hours after the video went viral. But inside the system, the real death happened quietly, legally, without drama, just one screen at a time, one form at a time. And in that slow administrative dissection, Rick Allen became what systems were designed to forget: a ghost without a folder, a name without a title, a badge without memory. Down the polished corridors of the Brenton County Records Division, the deletion continued, not just with physical plaques or digital entries, but with the slow unraveling of associative memory. In offices where Rick Allen's name had once been casually referenced in internal memos, it was now marked for redaction. Automated filters scanned archived emails, replacing Sheriff Allen with anonymized tags. Requests that once bore his signature were flagged with a yellow warning icon and the footnote, "No longer valid, originating authority revoked." What once was recognition became contamination. In a small sub-office 2 floors below, a clerk opened an awards ledger, a thick-bound volume maintained as both tradition and backup against digital failure. It had dust on the spine, leather cracked with time, but its contents were meant to endure, until now. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with a surgical sense of order, flipped to the section labeled 20-132-023 Community Impact Citations. There, centered between 2 embossed lines, was Rick Allen's name, awarded for outstanding service and dedication to civil harmony. The irony hung in the air like smoke. With careful fingers, she removed the page using a razor blade. Not torn, not blacked out, excised. In another building, One more connected to the public. A curator at the Brenton Law Enforcement Museum received a silent update via internal email. Remove Exhibit 7. Sheriff Allen, uniform. No explanation, no room for interpretation. The curator, a former officer herself, stared at the glass case for a long moment before moving. Inside the display, Allen's old patrol hat, a clean-pressed khaki shirt with sergeant pins, and a photo of him shaking hands with the mayor no one respected anymore. The curator unlocked the case and lifted the items out, one by one, folding them with quiet disdain. The photo she didn't fold. She dropped it face first into a black folder and sealed it shut. No future tours will speak his name, she whispered to herself. In Washington, D.C., far from Brenton but deeply entangled in its fallout, an internal memo was issued by the Office of Ethical Oversight. It was short, sharp, and final. Subject: Rick Allen. Classification: terminated with prejudice. Action: initiate Tier 3 data purge. The meaning of those 6 words was known to only a few, but they carried a weight heavier than law. Tier 3 meant systematic cleansing from grant records, DOJ award databases, recruitment pipelines, and internal training modules. He wouldn't just be fired. His influence, however small, would be vacuumed from the bloodstream of the system. A national undoing, line. And somewhere beneath the surface of all these actions, Allen himself sat in a house that no longer belonged to his rank. The walls were still hung with citations, at least the ones he hadn't been forced to remove. But even there, among the last symbols of the man he used to be, the silence pressed in. His phone no longer rang. His inbox had dried to nothing. Even the hateful messages stopped, as if the public itself had moved on from anger to erasure. There was no longer energy to hate him, just a quiet decision: you do not exist. In the sheriff's office where he once reigned, new officers walked past the wall where his portrait had hung. It was now blank. Some slowed to glance. None stopped. For younger recruits, Allen was becoming a rumor, a cautionary tale told in lowered voices during orientation, stripped of nuance, delivered like doctrine. There used to be a man here, one might say. He thought the badge was a mirror for power instead of a window for service, and that would be the end of the story. A final act took place not in Brenton but in the state capitol. There, on the 6th floor of the Department of Public Safety, a senior analyst logged into the Unified Federal Database, a master log of all officers certified within the past 50 years. She searched Rick Allen. One result returned. She hovered her mouse over the entry. Name: DOB. Issued badge number. She selected the final field. Status. It still read, certified active. With a single keystroke, she changed it to decertified, ineligible for service. The entry blinked red, then gray, final, irreversible. She didn't lean back or sigh. It wasn't her job to feel. It was her job to ensure the system remembered only what deserved remembering. And in that moment, Rick Allen joined a rare fraternity, not of fallen heroes, but of those forcibly forgotten, men whose names were not taught as mistakes, but omitted altogether. The next day, a new sheriff's induction ceremony took place. No mention of the previous holder, no transition. The name Allen never passed anyone's lips. The seal on the podium had been redone. The stationery was reprinted. The databases cleared. And when the new sheriff took her oath, her eyes didn't glance backward. History was not only written by the victors, it was erased by the survivors. Somewhere in the shadow of erased names and rewritten titles, a quiet ripple spread through adjacent systems, affiliations, associations, credentials. The Brenton County Law Enforcement Union received a routine synchronization alert. The system blinked, paused, then removed Rick Allen's name from its historical roster of past presidents. No ping, no notice, just a silent line vanishing into digital ash. His due record was nullified. The badge number, once attached to internal case files, now returns a no-user error. In the eyes of the machine, he was never there. Further downstream at the National Law Enforcement Symposium Archives, A web team was instructed to audit all panel recordings and participant transcripts from the past 2 decades. Within hours, Allen's voice, once featured in keynote sessions, workshop Q&As, and a controversial lecture titled Command Presence and Community Boundaries, was silenced, audio redacted, transcripts trimmed. His panels were marked with a sterile disclaimer, former official excluded from educational archive due to ethical violations. And with that, the last shred of his voice was overwritten by a legal asterisk. Meanwhile, back in Brenton, the building maintenance crew moved with cold efficiency. The placard outside the sheriff department door, once engraved with authority, Rick Allen, Sheriff, was now blank aluminum. The holes left behind from the mounting screws were filled with putty and sanded down, not patched, not covered, removed so completely that no residue remained. The wall was repainted. No one asked what color. No one cared. What mattered was that the wall no longer remembered. In the digital back end of public service networks, the cleanup continued. The state's official press release archive contained several bulletins in which Allen had been quoted. In all instances, editors inserted a quiet edit. Statement removed due to disciplinary action against former officer. An invisible ghost of accountability echoed in that footnote. Reporters looking to cite past enforcement strategies found broken links and removed pages. Journalism that once lionized his zero-tolerance stance now reads like cautionary footnotes. Outdated source, retraction in process, subject disqualified. Even the algorithms began to forget him. Social media platforms, once flooded with his face grinning in photo apps, Stoneface and Crisis began to starve the feed. The trending tab ignored his name. Recommendation engines purged videos with his tag. On video platforms, creators who had once interviewed or debated with him re-edited their uploads, cropping him out, muting his voice, or replacing him with slides reading, "Segment removed following ethics violations." There was no call for a boycott, just silence by attrition. Attention was the currency, and Rick Allen no longer had an account. Inside a high school civics textbook recently reissued statewide, a case study that once praised the Brenton model of enforcement integrity had undergone a surgical revision. Now, that same paragraph posed a question instead. What happens when authority is left unchallenged? No names were mentioned, no towns identified, but the timeline was clear. The implication sharper than any mention. Allen's impact wasn't immortalized, it was quarantined. In local meetings, community leaders discussed how to move forward. "This can't be about one man," said one council member. "It has to be about the systems that allowed him to believe he was untouchable." And so new measures were proposed. Body cam audits reviewed by independent civilians, AI-lag dialogue protocols to catch microaggressions, and an annual rotation of senior posts to avoid entrenched power. All of these reforms would live on in policies Allen would never read, crafted by people he had once dismissed. His legacy, if anything, was now policy drafted in his absence to prevent the next him. Back at his house, Allen stared at a framed certificate that had yet to be removed. It sat in the hallway, a reminder of a lifetime of calculated ambition. Presented to Sheriff Rick Allen in recognition of 25 years of devoted service to the protection of order and community trust, he had polished it once a week. Now it collected dust like a relic cursed by relevance. A knock came at the door. Mail delivery. Inside the envelope, a formal letter from the National Peace Officers Memorial Fund. Your nomination for permanent engraving on the officer's wall of honor has been rescinded. No condolences. Just that one line. He didn't open any more letters that day. He tried calling the Central State HR office the next morning. The automated line looped him twice before a human voice finally responded. "I'm sorry, Mr. Allen, but we no longer have records tied to that identification number. If you're seeking assistance, you'll need to start a new application under a revised status." He asked, "What's status?" A beat of silence. Then, "Former officer, misconduct, discharge." "That's what the system returned, sir." He hung up before she could finish her apologies. By midweek, he visited the regional public library. A portrait once hung there, in full regalia, taken after his promotion to sheriff, had been removed. The space was blank now, the wall freshly painted, the label that once read Sheriff Rick Allen, Brenton County's finest, replaced by a small sign that simply read, Reserved. Not even a new honoree. Just space reclaimed. He asked the librarian, "Where's my photo?" She didn't blink. "We've updated our collection. The archives no longer support recognition of individuals removed under misconduct." There was no argument to make. No headline to threaten. The room was already moving on. The final blow came in pixels. A documentary, originally filmed as a tribute to Brenton's law enforcement leadership, was re-released on streaming with director's revisions. Allen watched, stiff and silent, as every frame that once included his voice, his commands, his staged heroics, had been rescored, recut, and narrated by a voiceover stating, "This footage contains former officials whose actions have since been discredited. Their presence remains only as evidence of what systems must never ignore again." He wasn't even a villain, just a case study. He stood in front of a mirror that night, wearing the last official shirt he owned, the one with faded collar patches, unwashed since suspension. He looked into the mirror, expecting fury, some rage, a scream from the gut, but all he saw was a man no longer recognized by the walls, the wires, or the world that once saluted him. He whispered to the room, "I kept order." The silence disagreed. The next morning, a group of interns from the Department of Public Memory arrived at the Brenton Archives for orientation. One of them, curious, asked the tour guide, "Why is there a blank panel in the Sheriffs of Brenton wall?" The guide, a woman in her 60s, paused. "That space belonged to a name we no longer teach. It's there to remind us that some legacies are better remembered as voids." The intern wrote that down, word for word. Across the state, Allen's name had become something akin to an old error code, something seen in logs but never explained. People didn't curse him, they didn't chant his name, they simply passed over it like a glitch they had learned to skip. His career wasn't condemned, it was deleted. In a private office in the Capitol, an aide reviewing policy drafts opened a file and noticed a footnote that once referenced Sheriff R. Allen. It had a red strike-through. The new replacement read, "Example removed, not a valid source of ethical enforcement." The aide didn't know who Allen was. She didn't need to. He was no longer in the conversation. The true punishment wasn't prison. It wasn't even public scorn. It was disintegration. Systemic, quiet, and administrative. Rick Allen, once loud enough to order arrests with a glance, now could not even command a record to spell his name. And in that vanishing, no bell was tolled, no gavel slammed, just the soft hum of a server somewhere, overriding him. He stepped into the bar just after dusk, the same one where laughter used to break against the walls like waves on rocks, where badges clinked louder than beer bottles, and old stories of arrests and bruises were exchanged like war medals. Now, the light felt different, colder. The neon flickered once, hesitated, then held. Allen's boots tapped against the scuffed wooden floor like a metronome in a room that refused to follow tempo. The bartender caught sight of him, but didn't say a word. No nod, no raised brow, no welcome. Just a slow glance held too long before it dropped like a curtain. The man returned to polishing a glass that was already dry, hands moving in practiced dismissal. Allen took the same stool he'd used for over a decade, right near the taps, where he could see the front door and the pool table in one sweep. He waited. No drink came. Behind him, a group of 4 off-duty officers in plain clothes stood near the pool table. One of them leaned over to line up a shot, but paused. Chalk, mid-air, gaze fixed on the back of Allen's head. Murmurs followed, clipped like code, deliberate and low. Then, without a word, they all placed their cues down on the table in synchronized rejection and moved to another corner. Not one of them looked at him directly, as if even a glance would be an acknowledgement he no longer deserved. Allen shifted slightly, uncomfortable now in a place that once molded itself around him. The bar's music played as always, classic rock, something steady and predictable, but it moved through him like air through a closed fist. His fingers tapped once on the bar top, Still no beer, no coaster, no check-in from the bartender. He cleared his throat softly. Nothing. A man in a trucker hat, seated 2 stools away, turned his head just enough to speak without eye contact. His voice was flat, almost courteous, but colder than steel. "This table doesn't serve the kind who once poured water over the head of the woman my mother wanted to become." Then he sipped his beer as if he hadn't said anything at all. Alan said nothing. He could feel the heat crawling up his neck. Not rage, but that rarest of things for a man like him. Recognition, not the kind you crave, the kind you run from. He kept his back straight, but it felt like wearing bricks. His fingers hovered above the counter, unsure whether to knock again or walk out. He didn't move. From the jukebox, the music played on. "Don't Stop Believin'," a song that once triggered tabletop singing and fist-banging applause. But not tonight. Tonight, the rhythm refused him. He was off-beat in a world that once danced to his tune. The bartender finally walked over, but not to serve him. He pulled down a sign from above the shelf. It read, "Lawmen Specials, Past and Present." With the ease of routine, the bartender removed Alan's framed photo from the lineup and replaced it with a bottle of hot sauce. No explanation, no audience, just a quiet rectification. Alan stood up slowly, the bar stool screeching against the floor like a protest that wouldn't be heard. He looked around once, half hopeful, half defiant, but no one met his eyes. It wasn't hatred that filled the air. It was erasure, like the room had moved on without his consent. He walked toward the door, every step echoing louder than the music. Behind him, conversations resumed. Laughter picked up. Glasses clinked. A game restarted at the pool table with new players. Life flowed around the vacuum he left behind. In the street outside, the air felt too sharp. The sky had turned the color of regret-muted blue, with no stars willing to shine over him. He lit a cigarette with trembling hands. The flame danced once before going out. He didn't bother trying again. Back in the bar, the man in the trucker hat turned to the bartender. "Think he'll come back?" The bartender wiped his hands. "Not if he's smart." They went back to their drinks. No one mentioned his name again. Not that night, not the next. Rick Allen, former sheriff, former regular, former name on the board, had become something less than memory. He was silent in the room he used to own, and silence has the longest echo. He had not heard the door close, but she was gone. Her perfume, faint and sharp like cedar wood after a rain, lingered for a while in the empty kitchen. On the table sat a manila envelope with a legal header visible beneath the fold. Alan stared at it with the dull curiosity of someone observing the scene of his crash. Divorce. The word is printed in bold serif across the top. No flourish. No hesitation, just the final punctuation of a life that had cracked open quietly. The TV flickered in the living room, casting a nervous light across the floor. A local news anchor, crisp in her delivery, announced in even tones, "In a formal statement issued this afternoon, Mrs. Elaine Allen filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences." She paused before continuing, her gaze narrowing ever so slightly. In an exclusive interview, she elaborated, "I'm not divorcing a man who poured water on an elderly woman. I'm divorcing a man who didn't see what was wrong with it." The clip ended with a shot of her walking away from the camera, spine tall, heels clicking like a judge stepping down from the bench. Alan sat motionless in his recliner, watching the screen dissolve into commercial nonsense, medications, and mattresses. But it felt like the world had made its decision. No trial, no jury, just that sentence. "I'm divorcing a man who didn't see what was wrong with it." His hand reached slowly toward his phone, the muscle memory still strong despite the trembling fingers. He opened his contacts, a list of names, familiar names, people who once patted him on the back in the locker room, laughed too loudly at his bar jokes, slapped his shoulder when he walked into a room. He scrolled past them all. None of the names glowed green anymore. No one was online. No little dots indicating typing. Just silence, flat, cold, digital. He opened a message thread to his son. The last message was over a year ago, a birthday wish. Ignored. This time, he typed nothing. He didn't know what to say that wouldn't come out wrong. that wouldn't drip with the same acidic tone he used with strangers. Before he could decide, a new email alert pinged. Subject: Michael Allen. Subject: Don't. The body of the email was bare, just one line. Don't ever call me again. There was no rage in it, no blistering paragraph of blame, just a quiet guillotine that fell without tremble. He clicked it open, then closed it. Opened it again. Closed it, as if doing so might change the words or bring some hint of doubt, but it was airtight, sealed with indifference. He placed the phone down like it might explode and sat back. The silence in the room was not peace, it was exile, the kind of silence that made even the refrigerator hum sound accusatory. He walked to the liquor cabinet and poured a finger of bourbon, not because he needed a drink, but because he didn't know what else to hold on to. From the hallway mirror, his reflection stared back at him, less like a person and more like a ghost with weight. His eyes were bloodshot from nights without sleep and days without blinking long enough to feel. He studied his face, the creases along his mouth that had deepened not from laughter but from curling lips into lines of contempt. The man looking back had once worn a badge with arrogance and pride. Now he was stripped to the bones of consequence. He stepped outside for air, hoping the night would wrap around him and erase the feeling of shrinking. But even the dark had corners that glared. Neighbors closed their curtains. Porch lights turned off as he walked by, as if he carried contagion with his boots. He paused at the mailbox, hesitated to open it, but habit won. Inside were bills, catalogs, and a thin white envelope with no return address. He tore it open under the yellow porch light. Inside was a single photo, printed from a screenshot. It was the still frame of him standing over Alma Watkins, the bottle tipped in his hand, her hair soaking through with glistening rivulets of humiliation. No words, just imagine. He looked around instinctively, as if someone might be watching to see his reaction. But the street was empty, the silence relentless. He slid the photo back into the envelope, crushed it into his coat pocket, and walked back inside. Each step felt like sinking, like a man learning that gravity applies more to the fallen. He didn't cry, not because he was strong, but because the well had dried somewhere back between regret and understanding. The man who once barked orders at recruits, who once thought control came with volume, now moved through his house like a trespasser in a life he no longer recognized. Upstairs, the bedroom door was ajar. The closet had a gaping hole where Elaine's clothes used to hang, a single hanger twisted in place like a question mark. He sat on the edge of the bed and picked up her pillow, holding it like it might still breathe her name. It didn't. The headlines hadn't stopped. The world didn't let go of its prey that easily. Every new outlet had its version of the fall. Op-eds, analysis, public opinion polls with numbers sinking like stones. But it wasn't the public that hurt him now. It was the absence of private grace. The way his wife had spoken on camera, calm, unwavering. The way his son hadn't even capitalized the subject line. No hatred, no shouting, just withdrawal, a refusal to acknowledge him with anything more than a line of separation. It was surgical, and it bled more than he thought possible. The punishment of rejection was this: no stage to scream on, no platform to plead from, just the vast, quiet denial of access. The people who mattered didn't curse his name. They simply erased it from their future. They didn't burn bridges, they just never walked that way again. Downstairs, the bourbon remained untouched. The house smelled of stillness. In the distance, a neighbor's dog barked once, then fell silent. Even the dog knew. He took his phone one more time, searched through the contacts again, tapped on a name, his former deputy. A friend once, that friendship could survive the weight of power imbalance. The line rang twice, then straight to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. What could he possibly say? This wasn't punishment with shackles. It was abandonment by design. He had become a room no one entered, a name no one said. The world did not have to scream to bury him. It simply had to stop calling him back. And it had. The silence in Brenton had changed. It wasn't the hush of fear, nor the quiet before confrontation. It was the stillness that follows a storm, when every surface glistens from the damage done and the air carries the weight of clarity. Alma Watkins stepped down from the black government vehicle in front of Brenton High, her steps slow, unwavering, her hands clasping a small bundle wrapped in cloth, the very same cloth that had clung to her decades before and soaked up the insults and waters of a system that once drowned the dignity of people like her. The campus had changed, too. Where there once stood a blank concrete facade, now shimmered a brushed steel plaque, Alma Watkins Hall. The letters, unadorned and stern, seemed to push back against time itself. They bore no poetic flourish, no hollow dedication, only truth carved with intent. Inside the auditorium, it was standing room only. Rows of students, teachers, and parents filled the space, some holding programs, others holding silence in their throats. A banner hung behind the podium with no school crest, no slogans, just a purple background, the color of her old sweater, and a single white line across it like a horizon. Alma moved like time did when it remembered how to honor. She did not wave, did not smile performatively. She didn't have to. Her presence had grown past gesture. Samuel walked beside her, 2 steps behind, suit pressed, eyes forward. He had said nothing since they left the house that morning. He didn't need to. The bond between them no longer required words. The principal cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. His voice steady, rehearsed but reverent. We gather not to honor the past, but to commit to the future. And to that future we give this name, Alma Watkins Hall. Not for her pain, but for her power. Not for her silence, but for her refusal to scream when the world begged her to disappear. Applause was polite, almost too polished, but then Alma stepped forward, not to the mic, not to the podium, but to the very edge of the stage. With a breath as deep as grief, she unfolded the bundle in her hands. It was the sweater, the same lavender knit, slightly frayed at the cuffs, the water stains still faint but stubborn along the shoulder seams. She didn't speak. She simply draped it across the podium, one slow motion like draping a flag over a coffin, or placing a relic where it could live again. And then she stepped back. The room was frozen until a single hand clapped. A girl, then a boy, then dozens, then hundreds. It was not an explosion of sound, but a building wave, like recognition traveling from heart to heart. The applause did not erupt. It rolled, surged, and echoed against the rafters like an oath made of hands. There was no national anthem, no pledge, but in that sound a promise was made. Then a figure stepped onto the stage, a teenage boy, white, wiry, with a buzz cut and a tie just slightly askew. He looked out at the sea of faces, then turned to Alma. His voice, when it came, was clear, unshaken. "We didn't grow up to apologize," he said, not looking at the audience but at her. "We grew up to act right." There was no roar, just that sustained, undying applause, and within it, something truer than celebration, atonement. Samuel remained still. His face revealed nothing, but his hand gently brushed his mother's elbow. The smallest gesture. A lifeline was reversed. Once she had steadied him, now it was his turn, and the symmetry of it landed like a silent symphony across generations. Outside the auditorium, the skies over Breton were wide open. The media trucks stayed parked but kept their cameras off. There was nothing for them to exploit here, no drama, no shouting, just the slow, sure momentum of justice has grown roots in the soil. In the crowd, some students whispered stories they had read. About hoses, dogs, chains, fire, blood. Some didn't know details, but they knew the image. A woman with wet silver hair, eyes that didn't blink, and a stare that shook a country loose from its justifications. That image had imprinted itself into the curriculum now, not just in history classes, but in gym lockers, music rehearsals, even graffiti murals under the bleachers. One of those murals, painted without permission, showed a staircase of courtroom steps, and at the bottom, a figure seated in purple, back straight, face unseen. Above her, instead of the words, "equal justice," were painted 2 words only, "still here." And so she was, not to speak, not to campaign, but to exist as proof that dignity unbroken is the loudest form of resistance. Behind closed doors, the school board had debated the name change for weeks, not because they doubted Alma's worth, but because they knew this wasn't just a plaque, it was a verdict. A message to those who once walked these halls wearing Allen's badge with pride. This was not politics. It was a course correction. Later, a counselor would note a strange trend: fewer hallway fights, a drop in reported suspensions, not because fear had taken hold, but because reverence had. Students passed the building not with swagger, but with a pause. Some touched the wall, some looked up, some just slowed down for a step or two, like soldiers passing a grave. And Allen, where was he? Watching, maybe. Not there, but near. His name no longer chiseled into any wall, his portrait quietly removed from the City Hall foyer. But his shadow still roams the edges of town like a ghost that history refused to summon again. He had become absence incarnate, a warning more than a man. But Alma? She had become present, distilled, a monument not built of stone, but of memory, of restraint, of the moments she could have retaliated and didn't, of the chair she sat in and didn't rise from when insulted, of the bottle that spilled and the spine that stayed straight. The tribute ended without fireworks. No confetti, no marching band. The students filed out slowly, still clapping. Teachers herded them gently. Alma stayed seated until the room was nearly empty. Samuel leaned down and offered his arm. She took it, and together they exited, not as spectacle, but as center of gravity. Outside, the wind picked up, just enough to flutter the hem of the sweater left behind on the podium, just enough to remind anyone watching, stillness does not mean surrender. It never did, it never will. The silence that followed Alma's tribute was not just stillness, it was societal momentum redirected. And yet, somewhere, in a chamber scented with recycled air and stale ambition, Rick Allen tried to claw his way back into relevance. The setting was sterile, a human rights seminar sponsored by a half-forgotten think tank, a gathering that smelled more of damage control than activism. The carpet absorbed sound like guilt swallows justification, and Allen's leather shoes did not announce as he took a seat near the rear, eyes scanning, hands clenched. The memory of Alma's soaked but unbroken image burned into his retinas. The speaker on stage was listing off the impact of digital truth and the age of accountability when Allen leaned forward, his breath shallow, his body leaning toward the microphone stand like a drowning man sighting a lifebuoy. His name hadn't been called. No panel had acknowledged him, but Allen didn't wait. He stood suddenly, too suddenly, and his voice sliced through the muted murmurs like a broken promise. "I want to speak," he declared, chest out, eyes tight, a tremor in his jaw betraying his fragile intent. "There's another side to this story you haven't heard." A hush dropped like a curtain across the hall. Heads turned not out of curiosity, but out of disbelief that he still believed he had the right to frame a narrative. A hand reached under the moderator's table, pressed a single button. The microphone died mid-breath. Allen's mouth still moved, but no sound followed. The panelist closest to him, a woman with half-gray curls and thunder in her eyes, leaned forward without sympathy. "We don't amplify cruelty," she said, "and we do not let shame wear a suit and call itself insight." Allen froze. His arm still reached toward the podium like a man mid-confession, but the spotlight had never been his. The stage was for truth, and he had forfeited that long ago. Around the room, no one applauded, no one booed. They simply turned away, heads lowered not in respect, but in refusal. To listen to him would be to reopen a wound, and no one there believed he deserved the blood. He sat down, slowly, as if gravity were heavier on him than the rest of the world. He looked around for even one nod, one pair of forgiving eyes. Nothing. Not pity, not scorn. Just the space between people and the walls they draw when dignity has been lost. He had wanted to be understood, but understanding isn't given. It's earned, and Allen, once the voice in the room, wasn't even the breath between words. And so he listened, to silence, to to a truth that didn't include him, to a world that no longer needed his version. The sentence he tried to deliver, "There's another side to this story," hung in the void like a dead signal, never arriving, never welcomed. That was the verdict. Not shouted, not written, just made real by the air that would not carry his voice. That was the cost of his choices, and the world was finally collecting. It began slowly, like most cultural executions do, not with a verdict but with a joke. Someone on a message board shared the image. The freeze frame was unmistakable. Rick Allen, mid-pour, plastic water bottle in hand, standing above a woman too dignified to flinch. The caption beneath read, "Sheriff Aquafool." Another post called him H2O, but the name that stuck, the one the internet etched in digital ink and refused to let go, was simple: the Water Sheriff. From that moment, he was no longer Rick Allen. His legal name vanished from comment threads, news replies, and even article headlines. Where once he had demanded recognition, now he was reduced to a meme, a man without a name, a symbol of ridicule served up one share at a time. And the image didn't just live online, it thrived. Emoji use evolved overnight. Whenever someone referenced him, they used the word drip or shower instead of his actual name. No direct tags, no search terms. Even algorithms struggled to keep up with the creative cruelty. He'd become folklore in real time, told through punchlines, roasts, and TikTok voiceovers mimicking his voice with plastic bottles crackling in the background. He was the sheriff who used water not to heal, not to cleanse, but to humiliate. And the people answered back with laughter, so loud it made headlines. One meme showed Allen photoshopped inside a freezer aisle, captioned, "The ice-cold police chief never once managed to cool a human heart." Another clip showed someone reenacting the scene using dolls, Barbie as Alma, G.I. Joe as Allen, the water a slow-motion pour, accompanied by circus music. On YouTube, a parody song reached 1.2 million views in a week. It's the chorus, "You can pour your hate, but you can't rinse your shame." He tried to delete his profiles, Facebook gone, Twitter erased, LinkedIn deactivated, but the internet does not forget. It archives, it mirrors, it duplicates and spreads and laughs harder the more someone runs, and Allen ran. But not far enough. One afternoon, he walked into a grocery store 3 towns over, hoodie pulled low, eyes down. He moved like someone practicing invisibility. At aisle 9, near the bottled water section, a child tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered too loudly, "is that the man who spilled the water on the lady's head?" The mother didn't hush her. She just turned and walked the other way, leaving Allen frozen beside a tower of discounted Dasani. At the checkout line, the cashier scanned his items silently until she reached the water bottle. She paused, looked him in the eye, then placed the bottle aside slowly, as if it were contaminated. "Sorry," she said, voice level, "that one's not for sale." He left without his groceries. Even official coverage had turned. News anchors no longer said former Sheriff Rick Allen. They used phrases like the disgraced officer once involved in the Brenton incident. Journalists avoided his name intentionally. Op-eds referred to him in lowercase, like he'd become an idea instead of a person. Law schools began using his case as a cautionary tale, not of excessive force, but of symbolic missteps turned viral poison. He was a walking parable, cited in slideshows under the section titled, "What Not to Do When the World is Watching." Allen tried to write a rebuttal, a Medium article under an anonymous name titled, "When Context is Lost." But the internet detectives were fast. Within an hour, his IP was traced, and the piece was ratioed into oblivion. Comments flooded in. "Still thirsty, Sheriff? Context? We saw the whole pour. You didn't lose context, you lost character." When he attended a community meeting in a nearby county under another name, a woman at the registration desk squinted at him and said, "Aren't you?" He turned before she could finish. His life became a series of half-finished questions and full-bodied avoidances. Even those who didn't recognize him directly seemed to pause around him, as if his presence created a ripple in the air, the way a long-dried bloodstain still changes the way people walk over a floor. He sought redemption from old colleagues, emails sent, left unread, calls made, never returned. Even the worst among them, the ones who once laughed at his jokes, now pretended not to remember. Denial was the cheapest shield they had. One former deputy, when asked about Allen on a podcast, replied, "Water who?" And that was it. His name became ghost code, whispers and symbols and digital shorthand. Parents used him as a lesson. You don't want to be like him. Teachers invoked him in social studies. This is how public trust is lost in one pour. And in online slang, his nickname evolved again. Now, to Allen, someone meant to ruin your credibility while thinking you were making a point. Still, Allen refused to disappear completely. He showed up once at a local city hall, tried to volunteer. A clerk politely declined. "We don't have any open roles for public engagement." When he asked if there were private ones, the clerk smiled, not cruelly but firmly. "Not for your profile." The cruelest punishment wasn't prison. It wasn't even poverty. It was irrelevance, cloaked in mockery. It was seeing yourself reflected not in hate, but in satire. Hate still implies someone thinks you matter. Satire means they've moved on, that you're not even a warning anymore. You're entertainment. He walked past a group of teens once, in a park, where a mural of Alma had been painted in full purple glory. One of the kids threw an empty bottle toward a bin and missed. "Yo!" someone said. "Don't Allen it!" Laughter. The bottle was picked up and placed in the bin. Alma's eyes in the mural didn't need to move. The kids already knew what respect looked like, and so did he. And so, piece by piece, day by day, emoji by emoji, Allen's name was unwritten, not erased by court order or legislative motion, but by the people. And the people, in their infinite creativity, replaced it with something that couldn't be appealed, couldn't be redacted, and couldn't be argued with. The name you choose is your identity. A name you earn is a legacy. But a name the world gives you in mockery, that's the scar no mirror will reflect properly, because even your reflection is tired of calling you back. The sun sat low above the town of Brenton, throwing long gold slants across the courtyard of a freshly painted school that now bore Alma's name. Inside its modest auditorium, the air hummed, not with restlessness, but with reverence. Middle schoolers in pressed uniforms and thrifted jackets sat shoulder to shoulder, listening to a woman whose presence needed no amplification. Alma Watkins stood at the front, her purple cardigan carefully draped over her shoulders like memory woven into fabric, her gaze calm as she addressed the quiet crowd before her. "I wasn't much older than some of you when I learned that silence is louder than noise," she said, voice low but cutting clean through the stillness. "We marched for miles, not for pity, but for dignity. And yes, water was poured on us, fists raised against us, boots turned our backs into roads. But we stood, and we kept standing." A girl with thick braids raised her hand slowly, almost shyly. "Were you ever scared? When they poured water on you, I mean? Were you afraid?" The room leaned forward. Alma smiled. Not wide, not soft, but like a weathered mountain acknowledging a breeze. She tilted her head. "Do I look like I'm shaking now?" The class laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt like an invitation to breathe. Even courage could be gentle. In the back, Samuel stood quietly against the wall, his arms folded, a visitor's badge barely visible beneath his blazer. He didn't need to speak. His mother's voice echoed through him just as clearly. Outside, the school gates creaked slightly as Rick Allen walked by. He had no reason to be there. No child to pick up, no meeting to attend, but something had pulled him toward the place. Maybe guilt, maybe ego. Maybe he just wanted to know if he still mattered. The campus hadn't acknowledged him. It had simply kept moving, built forward, and now it had left him behind. His steps slowed when he heard her voice, not from a TV, not behind a microphone, but here, surrounded by those who listened without cynicism, who hadn't been born when the bottle fell, who knew the clip before they knew the Constitution. Alma's voice carried outside, soft yet undeniable, as though even the breeze deferred to her. Allen paused by the fence, looked in. Through the window, the students were watching her with wide eyes, open ears. And then, Something shifted. A few of them turned, just subtly, as if sensing something unclean pressing up against the edge of their space. Then more turned, one by one, until 12 pairs of young eyes looked out across the field, straight toward him. No one shouted, no one pointed, but the weight of their attention dropped like bricks on his back. They knew. These kids, born of hashtags and handheld truth, had never shaken his hand, never seen him in uniform, yet they recognized him more clearly than anyone ever had, not through whispers, through understanding. Alan's breath caught. His shoulders hunched slightly, his eyes dropped before theirs could finish speaking what needed no words. These weren't stares of anger. They were indictments. He turned quickly, walked, faster than before, faster still as laughter from the classroom trickled out, clear and spontaneous, not cruel, not mocking, just real. And that made it worse, because that laughter wasn't for him. It didn't include him. It didn't even notice him. He had become the silence outside a life that no longer held space for his presence. Each step he took echoed louder than the last, not because his boots were heavy, but because his relevance had turned into noise only he could hear, and it wouldn't stop. Inside, Alma resumed her story, unbothered by the shadow that had passed beyond the window. She spoke of bridges and baton strikes, of sermons given from jail cells, of dignity stitched into the seams of protest marches. One boy whispered, "She's a real one," and everyone agreed. Outside, the wind picked up, not harshly, just enough to remind Alan that he was no longer even the villain of the story, just its discarded footnote. No camera followed, no crowd waited. He moved through a world that had rewritten his name, redefined his legacy, and passed judgment without ever raising its voice. A generation had looked at him and made a decision, and that decision was final. The gallery was hushed, though not by rules. No velvet ropes, no stern docents patrolling the silence. Just the air dense, reverent, heavy with something greater than art. Justice, maybe, or grief, repurposed into resolve. On the far wall of the last room, there hung a single photo with no title, no placard, no curated context, just the image. An elderly woman was seated on stone steps, soaked through, hair silver clinging to her cheeks. A sweater heavy with humiliation was never accepted. Her spine did not bend. Her eyes did not plead. She simply sat, soaked in both water and memory, as if daring the viewer to blink first. That was it. No camera flash, no posed glamour, only the kind of truth that refused to be edited. People stopped there. Some walked past quickly, then turned back. Others lingered, brows furrowed, breathing shallow, as if they'd stumbled upon a mirror that showed them more than reflection. It showed them history, still dripping. One man placed his hand over his heart and whispered to the woman beside him, "That's the truth without explanation. That's what justice looks like before it grows legs." Outside, beyond the glass of the tall exhibition window, a man sat alone on a concrete bench. No one greeted him. No one asked for his name. A woman pushing a stroller walked by without so much as a glance. His face, worn and ruddy from time's silent verdict, was pressed forward just enough to see through the pain. He wasn't in the exhibit. He wasn't on any wall. He wasn't even a caption. But he watched. Rick Allen's eyes scanned the crowd's reaction to the image. The way strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, silent, struck by something they couldn't name but wouldn't forget. They didn't know him. More importantly, they didn't care. He was just another face beyond the frame. He was the reason the image existed, and yet, in this curation of memory, he had been excised, scrubbed not with malice, but with purpose. What had once been Sheriff Rick Allen was now nothing more than a cautionary omission. Inside, a young woman with coiled hair and a denim jacket tilted her head. "They didn't even give it a name," she said softly. "Because it doesn't need one," replied her friend. "Everyone knows who that is. Not him. Her. Always her." The photograph traveled, shown in museums from Atlanta to Berlin. Never altered, never touched. Not one curator dared explain it. It was always the same title on the program, Untitled. And every time, it was the image people spoke of on the way out, in cafes, in classrooms, in courtrooms. No filters, no slogans, just the truth soaked into a purple sweater. Alan remained on the bench for hours, some days, hoping, perhaps, for someone to exit the gallery and recognize him, to argue, to affirm his presence. But they passed him like a breeze through open doors, neither warm nor cold, just nothing. He thought he might reclaim something once, a narrative, a version, but this wasn't the kind of forgetting that came from mercy. It was erasure earned inch by inch, not by decree but by collective shrug. His name was not hated, it was unused. One day, a boy, barely 10, pressed his nose against the gallery window. His mother leaned over and said, "That's Alma Watkins. She's the reason your school has the mural." The boy nodded, wide-eyed. "She's the lady who didn't move when they tried to make her." That's right. No mention of the man in the photo, no memory of the sheriff, or the cuffs, or the smirk, or the water. Just the woman, and the rain that didn't win. Alan watched them walk away, slowly, in silence, without knowing he was 3 feet away, or not caring. There was no trial, no cell, no formal punishment was etched into the legal record. But this was the sentence, a lifetime of being a footnote and a shadow. He still breathed, he was still aging, but he no longer existed in the minds that mattered. Inside, a small child touched the wall under the image and whispered, "She looks like my grandma." And for that, she would be remembered forever. He would be nothing, not even a mistake, just absence.